There was a boy who watched his father ride to death. His name was Prince Aldric, and he was 16 years old, standing on a hill overlooking a plain where 200,000 men were killing each other. The battle had been raging for 3 days. 3 days of constant combat. No retreats, no pauses, just endless waves of soldiers crashing into each other, dying, being replaced, crashing again. The plain was carpeted with bodies, tens of thousands of them. The grass had disappeared beneath blood and mud. The air was thick with smoke and the screams of wounded men and the smell of death. And still, neither side would yield. Because this was not just a battle. This was the end of one world and the beginning of another. 2 dynasties, 2 kings, 2 visions of the future. Only one could survive. And Prince Aldric watched as his father, King Theodric the Bold, gathered the last of his cavalry. 3,000 horsemen, all that remained of the once mighty royal guard. His father looked back at him, met his eyes across the distance, and Aldric knew what his father was about to do. One final charge, one desperate gamble, ride straight through the enemy lines. Find the enemy king, kill him, or die trying. King Theodric raised his sword, turned toward the enemy, and charged into history. This is the story of the 3-day battle, of how 2 kingdoms destroyed each other on an open plain, of how a desperate cavalry charge changed the course of history, and of how a boy watched his father die to give birth to an empire. Because sometimes, the difference between victory and defeat is not strategy or numbers. It is the willingness of one man to sacrifice everything in a single moment, and hope that sacrifice means something. Do you know what it looks like when 2 kingdoms collide? The kingdom of Valerath and the kingdom of Dravonia had been rivals for 3 generations. Border disputes, trade conflicts, religious differences, small wars that flared and died. But the hatred had been building, growing, until finally, both sides decided that coexistence was impossible. One kingdom had to destroy the other, completely, permanently. So they raised their armies. Valerath brought 100,000 soldiers, infantry with pikes and swords, archers, cavalry, siege equipment, and King Theodric, a warrior who had spent his entire life preparing for this moment. Dravonia matched them, 100,000 soldiers of their own, and King Maleric the Ruthless, a commander who had never lost a battle, who believed that Dravonia was destined to rule the entire continent. The 2 armies met on the Plain of Sorrows, a flat expanse of grassland with nowhere to hide, no tactical advantages, no clever terrain to exploit, just open ground where numbers and will would decide everything. Both kings had the same plan: destroy the enemy. No retreat, no surrender. Fight until one side is annihilated. And that is exactly what they did. The battle began at dawn on the first day. Both armies advanced in formation, drums beating, banners flying, 200,000 men marching toward each other across the plain. The archers fired first, volleys of arrows darkening the sky. Men fell by the hundreds, then the thousands. But the lines kept advancing. When they met, the sound was like the world breaking. Shield crashed against shield, sword against sword. The front lines became a meat grinder. Soldiers pushed forward, killed the man in front of them, and were killed by the man behind. The formations compressed. Men could not swing their weapons. They stabbed and pushed and bit and clawed. And when they died, they could not fall. The press of bodies was too tight. They died standing up, held upright by the soldiers around them. The fighting was so intense that neither side could advance more than a few feet. They just killed each other in place, hour after hour, as the sun climbed and then began to set. Neither side retreated. Both sides kept feeding fresh troops into the meat grinder, replacing the dead, continuing the slaughter. By nightfall, 20,000 men were dead, and neither side had gained ground. Prince Aldric stood on the hill with the reserves and the camp followers and watched the battle with growing horror. He had trained for war his entire life, had studied tactics and read histories. But nothing had prepared him for this, for the scale of the killing, for the sound of 20,000 men screaming at once, for the sight of the plain, turning red with blood. His father had forbidden him from joining the battle. You are the heir. If I fall, the kingdom needs you. Stay here. Stay safe. Aldric had argued, had begged to fight, but his father had been firm. So Aldric watched, and felt shame. While men his age were dying on the plain, he was safe on a hill. But his father had been right. By the second day, Aldric understood why. Because the casualties were catastrophic. And if both the king and the prince died, the kingdom would collapse in a civil war. Someone had to survive to hold the kingdom together, even if that meant living with the shame of not fighting. The second day was worse than the first. Both sides were exhausted. Soldiers had not slept. I had not eaten. They fought through the night and into the morning. The bodies piled so high that soldiers climbed over corpses to reach the enemy. The plain became a landscape of death. Hills made of bodies. Rivers of blood. And still, neither side would retreat. King Theodric walked the lines, encouraging his men, fighting alongside them. His armor was covered in blood. His sword had broken and been replaced twice. He was 53 years old, too old to be fighting like a common soldier. But he led from the front, because that was what his men needed. They needed to see that their king was willing to die with them. King Maleric did the same on the other side. Two old men, both refusing to quit, both driving their armies to keep fighting past the point of exhaustion. By the end of the second day, 50,000 men were dead, half the combined armies. And still, there was no clear winner. The lines had barely moved. Both sides were bleeding out, and both kings knew that the third day would decide everything. That night, King Theodric called a council. His generals were exhausted, demoralized. They reported the casualties, reported that the men could not keep fighting like this, that morale was breaking, that if the battle continued like this for another day, both armies would be destroyed and neither kingdom would have the strength to survive. They needed a new strategy. King Theodric studied the maps, studied the reports, and made a decision. He could not win by attrition. Both sides were too evenly matched. Both sides were too stubborn to retreat. The only way to end this was to break the stalemate, to do something dramatic, something that would change the psychology of the battle. He needed to kill King Maleric. If the enemy king died, the Dravonian army would collapse. Their entire command structure was built around Maleric's personal leadership. Without him, they would fragment. But Maleric was in the center of his army, protected by thousands of soldiers. The only way to reach him was to charge straight through. A suicide mission. King Theodric looked at his cavalry commander, asked how many horsemen they had left. 3,000, the commander replied. Out of the original 10,000. Could they break through? The commander was honest. Probably not. But if they did, if they reached Maleric and killed him, it would end the war. King Theodric nodded. Then we try, and I will lead the charge. His generals objected. The king could not risk himself like this. If he died, the kingdom would fall apart. But Theodric was firm. That is exactly why I must lead. The men are exhausted. They have watched their friends die for 2 days. They will not follow anyone else into a suicide charge. But they will follow me, because I am their king, and because I will prove that I am willing to die for them. He turned to his son. Prince Aldric had been allowed into the council. Theodric looked at him and spoke words that would haunt Aldric for the rest of his life. If I do not return, you are king. Hold the kingdom together. Finish what I started. And remember this. Leadership is not about staying safe. It is about doing what must be done, even when what must be done will kill you. Aldric wanted to argue, wanted to beg his father not to go, but he saw the determination in his father's eyes. This was not a decision. It was a certainty. His father was going to charge, and he was probably going to die. All Aldric could do was nod, and promise that he would be worthy of the crown. The third day began with fog, thick and gray, covering the plain. Both armies formed up again, prepared to continue the slaughter. But King Theodric had other plans. He positioned his cavalry at the rear. Keep them hidden. Let the infantry engage first. The battle resumed. The same brutal, grinding combat. Soldiers killing each other by the thousands. The fog made it worse. Men could barely see. They swung at shadows, killed friends by accident. The confusion was total. And in that confusion, King Theodric prepared his charge. He gathered his 3,000 horsemen. Explained the plan. We are going to charge through the center of their line. We are going to find King Maleric, and we are going to kill him. Most of us will die. But if we succeed, we save the kingdom. Are you with me? The horsemen, exhausted and bloodied, raised their swords. They were with him, because he was their king, and because after 3 days of hell, they wanted it to end. even if ending it meant dying. The charge began at midday. 3,000 horsemen burst through the fog like thunder. They hit the Dravonian lines at full gallop, smashed through the infantry, trampled men beneath their hoofs. The shock was total. The Dravonians had not expected a cavalry charge through the center of their formation. They scrambled to respond, formed pike squares, tried to stop the horsemen. But King Theodric and his cavalry kept pushing forward, cutting down anyone in their path, losing men with every yard. Horses fell. Riders were pulled from their saddles and killed. But they kept going, because they could see their target, King Malaric's banner, flying in the center of the Dravonian army, surrounded by his personal guard, 300 elite soldiers whose only job was to protect their king. King Theodric and his cavalry crashed into them like a wave. The fighting was savage, close, personal. Theodric fought like a man possessed. His sword rose and fell. Men died, but the royal guard was skilled, disciplined. They cut down the horsemen, one by one. The cavalry was being annihilated, but they had gotten close. So close. King Theodric could see King Malaric now, 20 feet away. Malaric, realizing what was happening, drew his own sword, prepared to defend himself. The two kings met in combat, both old, both exhausted, both knowing that this moment would decide the war. They fought for less than a minute, but that minute felt like eternity. Theodric was stronger. Malaric was faster. They traded blows. Theodric's armor took hits that should have killed him. Malaric dodged strikes that would have ended the fight. And then, as the last of Theodric's cavalry fell around them, as the royal guard closed in, Theodric made a decision. He dropped his shield, grabbed Malaric's sword arm with his left hand, pulled him close, and drove his sword into Malaric's chest. The blade punched through armor, through flesh, through lungs and heart. Malaric's eyes went wide. He coughed blood and fell. King Theodric stood over the body of his enemy, raised his bloody sword, and shouted a single word, "Victory!" And then the royal guard killed him. Spears and swords from every direction. King Theodric fell, died on top of the man he had killed, but his shout had been heard. Across the battlefield, the Valarath soldiers saw their king's banner still flying, heard the word, "Victory!" and they surged forward. The Dravonians saw their king fall, saw King Theodric's final triumph, and their will broke. The army that had fought for 3 days without retreating suddenly collapsed. Units fled. Officers tried to rally them but failed. The battle turned into a rout. The Dravonians ran, and the Valarath forces, energized by their king's sacrifice, pursued them, cut them down. By sunset, the Battle of the Plain of Sorrows was over. Of the 200,000 men who had fought, fewer than 80,000 survived. 120,000 dead in 3 days. The plain was a graveyard. Bodies stretched as far as the eye could see. Both kings were dead, but only one kingdom remained. Prince Aldric, now King Aldric, rode down from the hill, through the carnage, to where his father had fallen. He found the body, still holding the sword, still lying on top of King Malaric. Aldric knelt beside his father and cried, not just from grief, but from the weight of what had just been placed on his shoulders. He was 16 years old, and he was now the king of a shattered kingdom, an army reduced to 40,000 exhausted survivors, a treasury emptied by war, and the responsibility to build something from the ashes. His father had won the battle, but Aldric had to win the peace. King Aldric spent the next decade consolidating power. He absorbed what remained of Dravonia into his kingdom, united the two peoples under one crown. It was not easy. There were rebellions, assassination attempts, political intrigue, but Aldric proved to be a capable ruler. He rebuilt the economy, reformed the military, established laws that treated both Valarath and Dravonian citizens equally, and slowly, painfully, he created something new. Not a kingdom, an empire, built on the ruins of two kingdoms that had destroyed each other. The Empire of Aldric became one of the most powerful nations on the continent. It lasted for 3 centuries, and it all traced back to 3 days on the Plain of Sorrows, to a battle where 2 kings refused to retreat, where 120,000 men died, and where one desperate cavalry charge changed history. But Aldric never forgot the cost. Every year, on the anniversary of the battle, he would ride to the plain of sorrows, to the mass graves where the dead had been buried, and he would stand at his father's tomb. The monument was built where King Theodric had fallen, and he would whisper the same thing. I built what you died for. I united the kingdoms. I created the empire. But I remember the price. I remember the 120,000 who died so that I could sit on a throne. And I promise you, I will never forget. I will never start a war for glory, only for survival, because I watched what were costs, and it costs too much. Historians called the three-day battle the bloodiest engagement in recorded history up to that point. Military academies studied it, analyzed the tactics, the decisions, the final cavalry charge that broke the stalemate, and they concluded that King Theodric's gamble had been brilliant. Risky, but brilliant. By sacrificing himself and his cavalry, he had won a war that could not be won any other way. He had broken the enemy's will by killing their king, had turned a stalemate into a rout, and had secured the future of his kingdom at the cost of his own life. But they also noted the casualties. 120,000 dead. For what? To decide which dynasty would rule. Both kingdoms had been destroyed in the process, and the empire that rose from their ashes was built on a foundation of corpses. Was it worth it? The historians debated. King Aldric had his own answer. He had it carved into his father's tomb. Here lies King Theodric the Bold, who charged into death to give birth to an empire. He won the battle, but we all paid the price. The Plain of Sorrows became a memorial. No one farmed there. No one built on it. It remained empty. A vast field where grass grew over the graves of 120,000 men. People would visit, walk the grounds, and try to imagine what it had been like. 3 days of constant battle. No retreat. No surrender. Just killing and dying and the refusal to stop. Some called it the greatest military engagement in history. Others called it the greatest tragedy. Both were right, because the 3-day battle was both. It was a triumph of will and a demonstration of the horror of war. It created an empire and destroyed a generation. It proved that determination could overcome any obstacle and that the cost of that determination was counted in lives. 120,000 lives. Each one a person, a son or father or brother. Each one with dreams and hopes and futures. All of them sacrificed on an altar of ambition and pride and the belief that some things are worth dying for. Prince Aldric, who became King Aldric, who built an empire, he never forgot what he saw from that hill. The sight of his father riding to death. The sound of 100,000 men screaming. The smell of blood and smoke that hung over the plain for weeks. He ruled for 40 years, died in his bed, at peace. But his final words, recorded by the scribes at his bedside, were not about his empire or his achievements. They were simpler. Tell my father I kept my promise. I built something from the ashes, and I never forgot the cost. Never. The empire endured. The 3-day battle became legend, and the Plain of Sorrows remained. A reminder that glory and tragedy are often the same thing. That creating a new world sometimes requires destroying the old one, and that the line between heroism and madness is drawn in blood. 120,000 lives worth of blood, spilled over 3 days, on a plain that became a graveyard and a birthplace, both at once.